وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم وأكمل التحيات على سيد المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا محمد حبيب رب العالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on the Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya of Imam al-Birgivi rahimahullah ta'ala, we've been looking at the investigation on how do we rid ourselves of insincerity, of riya, or active insincerity, which is showing off. And this is of the most important of matters. And we saw how we approach ridding ourselves of insincerity by the acquisition of sincerity, right? And the acquisition of sincerity requires understanding the virtues of sincerity and the reality of sincerity, because you can only actively seek something if you first know what it is, secondly, why it's important, thirdly, how to acquire it, right? Theoretically. But then you also need a practical toolkit of how to bring it into your life. So he tells us, rahimahullah ta'ala, that وَالْعِلَاجُ الْعَمَلِ, right? The active treatment, right? The active treatment for insincerity and for acquiring its opposite, namely sincerity, ikhlas, he says, is ikhfa'ul amal. Right? Is ikhfa'ul amal. Is to conceal one's actions. Meaning those that can be concealed, right? Those that can be concealed, right? So when you can do something publicly or privately, the sincere person would seek to do it privately out of the abundance of caution to seek sincerity, unless there's a clear interest that cannot be attained by doing it privately through doing it publicly. Right? And very often people delude themselves regarding this, right? And different people's circumstances differ. So they say, well, I want to give in charity so that others may follow me. Do people follow you in general in life? No. Then why do you think that by giving charity others will follow you if you do it publicly? For example, sometimes you can separate the two actions. Give it privately, and without saying it, encourage others to give it. You don't have to say, I gave, so please give, right? No one really cares that you gave, right? It may be sufficient, right? By encourage them in some other ways. So to incline towards وَالْعِلَاجُ الْعَمَلِ إِخْفَاءُ الْعَمَلِ, the practical treatment begins with concealing one's actions when possible. وَإِغْلَاقُ الْبَابِ, and closing one's door. Right? And of course, closing one's door here is not just closing the physical door, meaning إِغْلَاقُ بَابِ الرِّيَاءِ, closing the door to insincerity. How? Right, the treatment of things is by identifying their cause and then preventing that cause. So what is it that leads to the showing off? To close that door to it. Right. The fuqaha sometimes refer to that as saddu dhara'i', closing the means to the mafsada, to the harm. إِلَّا مَا لَزِمَ إِظْهَارُهُ, except that which is required to manifest. Right? Such as praying in congregation, for example. Right? Or, or performing the outward sunnahs. Right? Performing the outward sunnahs. That's the first. The second, وَالضَّرْبُ الثَّانِي دَفْعُ مَا يَخْطُرُ مِنَ الرِّيَاءِ فِي الْحَالِ. The second way of practically treating it is to ward off the thoughts that occur of riya, of insincerity, immediately, fil hal. And we took that the more you let thoughts remain, the more hold they take over the heart. It's easier to ward off the khatir, the first thought, by ignoring it or negating it. When the khatir becomes taraddud, you start thinking about it, you let it in. The simplest way of dealing with the annoying guest is don't open the door for them. Okay? And then to ask them to leave when they're in the corridor. That's the taraddud. But now when they're entering the living room, it'll be harder to get them out. But they're only in when you let them sit on the dining table. That's when they dine on your sincerity. وَرَفْعُ مَا يَعْرُضُ مِنْهُ فِي أَثْنَاءِ الْعِبَادَةِ. And to lift what falls off, what enters of it into one's worship, during the worship. So you're praying and you realize that someone you respect has come in. You get the thought of improving the prayer because they've come there, to negate those meanings. So how does one do that? To begin with sincerity. فَعَلَيْكَ فِي أَوَّلِ كُلِّ عِبَادَةٍ أَن تُفَتِّشَ قَلْبَكَ. So it is upon you at the beginning of each act of worship to look, to investigate your heart. فَتَّشَ يُفَتِّشُ تَفْتِيشًا is careful and close investigation. Right? So that's one of the dangers of heedless action. Right? Because a heedless heart is at the behest of the devil. Because if you're not walking purposefully, then he can take you on a field trip. To look carefully at your heart. وَتُخْرِجَ عَنْهُ خَوَاطِرَ الرِّيَاءِ. And to remove from your heart the thoughts of insincerity, of seeking other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So don't assume sincerity. Don't have husn al-dhan of yourself. Yeah, I'm sincere. I'm doing it for Allah. Why else would I be praying? There are all kinds of other motives. Right? وَتُقَرِّرَهُ عَلَى الْإِخْلَاصِ. And to firmly affirm sincerity upon your heart. Right? That's not just a token thing. Sincere, yeah, Allahu Akbar. Okay. But to make that explicit. وَتَعْزِمَ عَلَيْهِ. And to resolve firmly to have sincerity. إِلَى أَن تَتِمْ. Till the end of the prayer. And this is one of the neglected sunnahs of intention, which is istishabun niyyah, to carry the intention throughout. Right? To carry the intention throughout. Right? And here, Sidi Abdul Ghani Nabulsi, in his commentary, mentions something. Right? Right? Because, right? That, so the author of, so Sayyid Abdul Ghani quotes from Al-Ashbah wal-Nadha'ir, that the author of the Mujtaba says something very ghareeb, unusual, because others don't normally mention it, right? He said it's labud min niyat al-ibadah. It's necessary that you have the intention of ibadah, of worship. What? And the point being made, right? Because what is salah? It's a ibadah. Now it has a form that you're just doing it, but it has a meaning. What is ibadah? Right? So you intend ibadah. وهي التذلل والخضوع, because ibadah, your devotion, right? Ibadah is the state of acting on the realization that you are a abd to Allah, that you are absolutely indebted and needy to Allah. So it is a tadallul, it is completely humbling oneself, and al-khudu', and to lower yourself على أبلغ الوجوه, in the most emphatic of ways, right? And to intend to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Right? And what is obedience? And to be conscious of what is obedience. وَهِيَ فِعْلُ مَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ مِنْهُ, is to do what Allah seeks from you, and to وَنِيَّةُ الْقُرْبَةِ, and to intend to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is, and qurba is seeking reward by the exertion of effort. And one intends that one is doing it out of the interest of their religion, right? And so that one does the right thing, and that one fulfills the trust, and to keep away from wrongdoing, right? Right? And to maintain consciousness of these meanings from beginning to end. Right? So basically, the harm here is of heedlessness. You enter into prayer just heedlessly, praying for the sake of Allah, Allahu Akbar. The question is, the intention is the meaning that is firm in the heart. So sort of intention, has the intention permeated the heart? Right? Has the intention permeated the heart, or just pricked the heart for Allah, just like? But what are you presenting? Are you just preventing just the outer layer of the heart, or are you presenting your entirety? Right? So he says, right? So that this is why one has to make taftish, right? That what is my intent? وهي ثلاثة مرتبة, and the thoughts of insincerity are three. Right? What stirs insincerity in your worship are three, and each has to be warded off. الأول العلم باطلاع الخلق. One thing that causes insincerity is to know that people can see you. أو رجاؤه, or hoping that people see you. Right? So you go for a walk in the park and you've noticed Muslim families around. So you're praying in the empty parking lot. There's no one around. So are people seeing you? No. But you hope that someone does. That mashallah, he prays in the park. So he doesn't care about the, and you may delude us, I'm being sincere. I'm praying in front of even non-Muslims. But you're hopeful that people will recognize that, especially other believers, to be impressed. ثم الثاني الرغبة في حمدهم. Then comes the avidness that they praise you. وحصول المنزلة عندهم, and to have some status with them. So it begins by being aware that people are seeing you or will see you. Then their praise and recognition. ثم قبول النفس له. Then for yourself to accept this seeing or this recognition or this praise. وَالرُّكُونُ إِلَيْهِ, and to incline towards that recognition and praise. وَعَقْدُ الضَّمِيرِ عَلَى تَحْقِيقِهِ, and then for your inward to resolve to acquire that recognition or that praise. So the sooner you deflect that, the safer you are. So he tells us, فَعَلَيْكَ رَدُّ كُلٍّ مِّنْهَا. So it is upon you to ward off each of these. عَلَيْكَ رَدُّ كُلٍّ مِّنْهَا. Each one of these you need to ward off. How? أَمَّا الْأَوَّلِ, as for the first, meaning being aware that people are seeing you. فَبِأَنْ قَالَ, by having said to oneself, مَا لَكَ وَلِلْخَلْقِ, what do you want from people? عَلِمُوا أَوْ لَمْ يَعْلَمُوا, whether they know or whether they don't. إِنَّ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى عَالِمٌ بِحَالِكَ. Truly Allah knows your state. Right? And this is a realization of Tawheed. And when we say La ilaha illallah, there's no God but Allah, that La nafi'a illallah, none benefits but Allah. La darra illallah, no one can harm you but Allah. La mu'tiya illallah, no one who gives but Allah. Right? So that's why the great Imams say that don't look at creation, right? When you act, look only to the Creator. They say, اجعل معاملتك مع الله. Make your dealings with Allah. Now, don't notice them. Don't care whether they're there or they're not. He said, and if you must see them as dust in the wind. It is of no benefit and no harm. Now, of course, this does not mean that you neglect your spouse, your children. No. But you, even in your worldly matters, what you do for them is not actually for them, it's for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's most important in our acts of devotion, because those are sacred. Right? The acts of devotion are like the sacred valley in which you have to take off the sandals of worldly motives and personal desires before you enter. Now, but our worldly actions are the training ground for our spiritual works. Our spiritual works teach us sincerity to bring into the rest of our life. But what we do in the rest of our lives will color our worship. Because at work, if you're driven by, I'm going to put him down, I'm going to show them, I'm going to impress so-and-so, I'll do this, I'll do that. Where is sincerity in your life? It's nowhere. So when you get to the prayer, and your boss shows up, and now you have a Muslim boss, right? You'll become like Imam Ghazali in your worship. But is it for Allah or is it for the boss? But why? Because how you are in your other worldly choices will affect your prayer as well. Will affect your acts of devotion. Will affect your charity. Because you give the presentation to impress. You make the deal to impress. You talk about, the project that you completed to impress others. So when you give charity, you're going to do the same thing. Right? So even if you're not concerned about the reward of these things that make your worldly actions meaningful, but be concerned that this all, how you are in dunya, will color your deen. And vice versa. How you deen affects how you dine. Right? Like if your deen is for Allah, then this should carry over into your other things. Right? When the thought of them occurs, you negate that they don't benefit nor harm. You remind yourselves of the realities of Tawheed, of La ilaha illallah. Right? La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There's no ability nor power except by Allah. And one of the things that helps in doing that is to make a little bit of dhikr. Right? So you're about to go and give, it's at your work musalla. Like my brother-in-law was complaining. Said, he was working in one of the countries. We have some of the smartest Muslims around. But I don't know where they find these khatibs. Right? He said the only people who don't speak English and don't make sense are the ones who give khutbah. Right? So now you prepared a wonderful khutbah. You worked hard, etc. Now, and you notice that there's a few people who you've mentored before at work, etc. They look up to you. They're all there. And then that's going to say yes. Right? So what do? Pause there. How do you remind yourself? Because theoretical, they can't benefit me or harm me. Make dhikr with reflection. I say, La ilaha illallah. Right? When you say La ilaha illallah, what do we mean? There's none free of need of any other, whom all are in absolute need of except Allah. So what's their reality? They're in absolute need of Allah. So if they have their reality is they're in absolute need, then how can they fulfill any need or give you any benefit? So repeat La ilaha illallah. Right? With reflection of that meaning. There's none free of need of any other, whom all are in absolute need of except Allah. You have to say Subhanallah, all glory belongs to Allah. Alhamdulillah, all praise belongs to Allah. La ilaha illallah, Allahu Akbar. Right? La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Make a little bit of dhikr. Secondly, make dua. When sincerity is tested, you realize people are seeing you. Make dua. Right? Say, oh Allah, I ask you for sincerity, that you make this for your sake. Please remove from my heart. And by the very act that you're asking Allah for sincerity and these meanings is a sign that you're seeking it. And say it quietly, you don't have to make it. Because you can show off by asking Allah for sincerity. Right? And then to make explicit one's intention, right? Third thing is to make explicit your intention, right? And that's why the ulama found from the earliest times it beneficial to verbalize one's intentions, especially if tested. They're asking you to lead prayer, and your friends didn't know that you've been taking tajweed classes, so you get this thought. Right? So just pause. You know, oh Allah, I intend by this prayer, by this Salat al-Maghrib, your pleasure alone, right? And you make that intention. It can help to verbalize the intention. The ulama say it's recommended, right? And to say it in a manner that can help one gather verbalizing the intention is recommended as a means of gathering one's resolve. So verbalize in English, particularly if you find it tested. They're asking you to lead the prayer. They're asking you to read Quran at your cousin's wedding, and they're not all very practicing people. They'll be impressed, whatever, because you also have a good translation, whatever. So sincerity is going to be tested, right? But none of this, of course, should cause one to leave any act of good, right? In general, if there's reward in it, do it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and struggle with your intention. When there's no clear interest in it, right? You're in the park, there's nobody around, so no one's going to be following you in that. And especially if you don't find some strong intention, it's better to be discreet. It's better to be discreet. And they say, and especially in the beginning, there may be more reason to be discreet than when you practice, sincerity, right? And that's one of the things that don't overdo discretion. Right? Because if you overdo it when you're traveling. Okay, I want to be discreet about where I pray. Where are you going to find a private place at the airport? And very often, especially when you're in international travel, you're going from one gate to the other, etc. You don't have enough time to go find the prayer room, whatever. Then you can delude yourself that I'm trying to be sincere. No, that's a reverse worry of people. That you're trying to hide your religious practice from others. And frankly, nobody cares. Hey, nobody cares. Broadly speaking, right? I've flown through Paris in the worst of anti-Muslim center. Nobody really cares, right? You do it discreet. You don't have to go hide in some corner or something. Just go to the side, pray in a dignified way. Nobody really minds, right? Sometimes there's wisdom, right? If you have the right intentions to do it publicly, right? Like we are at a retreat at a far right Christian camp. I don't know why this Muslim group chose it. Shaykh and I were staying together in southern Texas. It's like rural southern Texas. And the organizer is saying on the way, there's several like lodges for the KKK and this and that, and these guys were borderline. So daily I had to use the internet. Internet was weak where our campsite was. So I'd go to the main center in the middle. There'd be people around, etc. I'd deliberately put on my jubba, etc. I'd even do a nafil prayer there, and people would come ask questions. And it's a good way of, and you have good intentions in it, and there's merit in that, because it dispels. This old lady, they were both lining us. I said, "Go ahead." I said, "What group are you from?" I said, "We're a Muslim group. We're here for an Islamic camp." At a Christian site? I said, "Yes." "But aren't you guys supposed to hate us?" I said, "No." I said, "Can you tell me about it?" I said, "Sure." "Well, would you like some tea or coffee?" Because we were both walking. So I gave her, she wanted tea. I helped her out, the old lady. And yeah, she sat down. I was just standing because I had work to do too. So tell me about it. Explained, etc. She had some question about, "Do you guys believe in Jesus?" I said, "Yeah, we believe he's a prophet of God." And she said, "That's amazing." I said, "God bless you and have a wonderful event and this and that." I said, "You gave me things to think about." I said, "Anytime." And so sometimes there's clear benefit in that as well, right? So this is not to be confused with, even at work, some people say, "I'm trying to be sincere, so I'm trying to pray in private." But you can't hide. If at work every day you have to step away. So this is not about, there's a hiding out of shyness from people, As a hiding and being here concealing with action, being discreet about them, not out of fear of people, but for the sake of sincerity. There's a difference, right? And the safety is purity of intent. Is purity of intent, and to cultivate that. Right? So he said, so to tell yourself that if Allah knows your state, فَأَيُّ فَائِدَ فِي عِلْمِ غَيْرِهِ, then what benefit is there in anyone else knowing? The second, وَأَمَّا الثَّانِي, and the second being, what's the second? The second is that when you get thoughts of insincerity, one is you see other people, you get thoughts of insincerity, he says, فَبِتَذَكُّرِ آفَاتِ الرِّيَاءِ, by reminding yourselves of the harms of insincerity. وَتَعَرُّضِهِ لِمَقْتِ اللَّهِ, فَبِتَذَكُّرِ تَعَرُّضِهِ, and by remembering that by insincerity you make yourself susceptible to the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the exact opposite of what you're doing this action for. Right? You know, so you're giving charity, which is meant to be for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but you do it by showing off and by this and that. So it's like, if you didn't do it, you only missed out on the reward. But by doing it insincerely, not only did you miss out on the reward, but you earned the displeasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well, which is far worse than just not having done it. Right? And making one susceptible to the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَيُثِيرُ كَرَاهِيَةً فِي مُقَابَلَةِ الرَّغْبَةِ. So this reminder should stir within one a dislike for insincerity in the face of the natural human inclination towards the praise and recognition of people. This is particularly in one's acts of devotion, that we've highlighted what they are. تدعو إلى الإباء في مقابلة القبول, causing one to turn away instead of being directed towards it. Right? Right? لا محالة والنفس لا محالة تطاوع أقوال المتقابلين, because the human self naturally submits to the stronger of two urges. Right? So when you have the urges of insincerity, you have to have another urge that is stronger than it to counter it. Right? Because you have an urge towards insincerity, towards recognition and praise and this and that. So you have to make either the dislike of it predominate, and that's one method. فلا بد في رد الخواطر الرياء من ثلاثة أمور. So therefore, to turn away the thoughts of insincerity, you need three things. Because the other, right? One is, the higher way is gratitude and love. It's gratitude and love. أَفَلَا أَكُونُ عَبْدًا شَكُورًا. Should I not be a servant who's truly grateful? Right? And to realize that, and to, and as Ibn Mashish said to a person who came to him asking for all kinds of advice, and he told him, like, what is all that? He said, if I have to give you one advice, فَعَلَيْكَ بِمَحَبَّةِ اللَّهِ, then you should have the love of Allah. He said, فَإِنَّ مَحَبَّةَ اللَّهِ, for the love of Allah, قُطْبٌ تَدُورُ حَوْلَهَا الْخَيْرَاتِ, is the axis around which all good revolves. Right? Yeah, you have these worldly inclinations, you can struggle, and it's toilful that, okay, well, I don't want to be punished, I don't want this, I don't want that. And especially when already we have, a lot of people feel so many burdens. That's why the ulama said, particularly, and interesting, throughout Islamic history, people have emphasized love and gratitude the most in the most testing of times. Because when times are challenging, people already feel burdened, feel heaviness. So they need inspiration, right? And sometimes we can't kid ourselves that we need inspiration, right? And that's why the most powerful of the prophetic urges is gratitude. Should I not be a servant who's truly grateful? Remember the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is worth it, right? Allah is worth it. And the meaning of love, right? The meaning of love, right? Sayyidina Ibrahim said, "La uhibbul afilin." I love not perishing things. Right? I love not things that wane. Right? So when you get thoughts of riya, you need three things. He says, من ثلاثة أمور. المعرفة. Right? You need awareness to know that this is a thought of insincerity. وَالْكَرَاهِيَّ له, and to dislike that thought so you don't let it in. وَالْإِبَاء, and refusal. But what is iba? Iba is don't discuss your thoughts, right? Right? Shaykh Adib used the example, like if you pass by, like bad thoughts are like a dog you pass by that's barking at you on the street, right? It's trying to bite. You don't talk to the dog. Excuse me, sir, why are you barking at me? It's not reasonable. There's no just cause for the dog to, what did you do to the dog? Why is it barking at you? Why is it trying to bite? So what do? Mind your own business. The dog's got nothing to do with you. It's not yours. Right? So thoughts of insincerity, etc., those aren't you. Right? Those aren't you. Right? Who are you? You're a servant of God. Your desires, your whims, that's not you. Right? So you don't pay attention. You know that these are dangerous, but don't open the door. It's like crank callers. Right? Like if you answer numbers that you don't know, what's going to happen? They'll keep calling you every day. Start getting, right? I never get crank callers, right? One, because I just don't answer the phone, right? I rarely, only if someone's in my address book, and even then, I'm quite likely not to answer the phone anyways. I never get crank callers. And now my friends don't call me either, but at least I don't get crank callers. My father-in-law decided to pretend he was insane. He did it a few times. He had a whale of a time. So they took him off multiple lists. But, so and to dislike it, and then to refuse it. Right? The thought comes, don't even consider it. Know it's harmful, and disengage from it. Right? وَقَدْ يَشْرَعُ الْعَبْدِ فِي الْعِبَادَةِ عَلَى عَزْمِ الْإِخْلَاصِ. A servant may enter the act of worship with the resolve of sincerity. ثُمَّ يَرِدُ خَاطِرُ الرِّيَاءِ. Then a thought of insincerity may come. Someone comes in, for example. And it can happen even when you're alone. You just, when you're getting up, you notice in the mirror that you're praying kind of bent. Say, well, now I lead prayer at work, so I should practice standing straight. But even when you're alone, why are you doing it? So that in the future, when you lead others, you can stand straight. Right? So you have to reject that. Right? But sometimes the danger with not being conscious of your thoughts is فَيَقْبَلُهُ بَغْتَةً. You may accept it immediately. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, circumspection brings only good. And haste is from the devil. Circumspection is, don't accept thoughts, ideas, until you consider it. Right? Right? And we rush to conclusions. Right? Right? And the Prophet ﷺ did not. Right? Even with people, they acted strangely. He not just react to them. Right? He acted with consideration. وَلَا يَحْضُرُهُ وَاحِدٌ مِّن وُجُوهِ الرَّدِّ. Sometimes you may accept it and no response occurred to you. But why does it happen? بسبب امتلاء القلب بحب الحمد. Because your heart may become full of the love of people praising you, for example. Right? Because you become so attached to it. So sometimes we need a spiritual detox. Right? We need a spiritual detox. Right? There's a beautiful hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that whoever is sincere to Allah for 40 days, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opens the well springs of wisdom from in their heart. Right? And there's something to practice. That sometimes one has to take some time out to cultivate sincerity. Right? So or to rectify your intention. Sometimes you may need to take some time out from certain things for the express purpose of recalibrating your sincerity in them. At other times, no, you can't do that. Right? At work, if you don't give the khutbah, no one else will, or it'll be much worse. So what do? Then you have to exaggerate the attempt at sincerity. You say, okay, I won't just show up and give the khutbah. Let me spend a few extra minutes in solitary worship. I won't go there and engage. At my terminal, I'll shut things down and I'll engage in a few minutes of reflection, of dhikr, of dua, and then go and give the khutbah so I can approach it with a sincere heart. Right? So you need, then, if you find that you succumb to thoughts, then either you may need to take a little bit of a time out to recalibrate, or you just may need to do extra sincerity preservation. Right? It's also good to consult. It's good to consult because sometimes we come up with drastic ideas. Right? We come up with drastic ideas. When I decided to start learning a little bit, one of the great scholars of our times visited Toronto. This is like 95 or so, 96 maybe. So I asked him that. I was involved in different Islamic projects and so on. I say, I'm thinking that in order to work on my sincerity, I'm thinking of stepping away from some of these things. He looked at me as if I was saying something really strange. I said, why would you do that? I said, just to work on my sincerity and so on, because it's easy to, you take, people praise you and this and that. He just looked at me. I said, only a fool would take pride in the actions of another. Why? Because your actions, did you create them? Even the thought of doing the good deed, did you create your thoughts? No. Say it is all from Allah. Right? We are indebted to Allah even for our good inspirations. Did you create yourself? Are you sustaining yourself? Did you create your abilities? Are you sustaining your abilities? Did you create your thoughts? Did you bring all your thoughts together? All the things that envelop your apparent ability to do something, it is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A few things being different, you'd be in a completely different situation. Okay? So only a fool would take pride in the actions of another. All this nexus of cause and effect, ability and power, it is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I said, so what do I do? So if there's anything of the good, do it, but work hard on your sincerity. How? Okay. And that's why one of the most important ways of cultivating sincerity is to have some private time with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To have some private time with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And that's the greatest benefit of the adhkar, of the dhikr that the Prophet ﷺ taught at morning time and at night time. The dhikr that the Prophet ﷺ encouraged us within the prayer and after the prayer. All of these, if you consider what you are saying, it is all cultivating sincerity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of it. Right? Because dhikr is meanings in the heart expressed by the tongue. The dhikr of the tongue is only expressing what's in the heart. Now, if there's nothing there in the heart, the dhikr of the tongue is only the precursor to real dhikr, which is the dhikr of the heart. But how do we bridge dhikr of the tongue with the dhikr of the heart? By actively trying to reflect. It's better to do a little bit of dhikr, but with an active heart, than just rush through a whole bunch of things. Alhamdulillah, I did all my morning dhikr. Did you pause and reflect even for a moment? Right? So that cultivates sincerity, right? Having some dhikr in the morning, at the end of the day, starting just with the sunnah dhikr before going to sleep, all of it, right? Right? Allahumma bismika amutu hayya. Allah, by your name do I die and come to life. Right? It's by your name that I place my, I lie down. Right? And all the things that we say affirm these same meanings. Even reciting the 3 quls, each of them. And what does it mean? A'udhu bi rabbin nas. Qul a'udhu bi rabbil falaq. Right? A'udhu, I seek refuge, meaning I flee from harm to your safety. Right? I'm fleeing to you in urgency, and what we say in them, right? So all of these are meant to, they have many, many wisdoms. But the beginning is that they're affirmations of faith. And when you find yourself immediately accepting inclinations of praise, it's because your heart's full of this love of praise. وَخَوْفِ الذَّمِّ, and fear of people's blame. Right? And this is, of course, one of the things that ruins people. Right? They know something's right to do, but they don't do it. Why? Because what will people say? What would happen if they say it? Nothing. Right? Nothing. Right? Right? وَاسْتِلَاءِ الْحِرْصِ عَلَيْهِ, and because avidness for worldly considerations has taken over the heart. فَيَغْرُبُ عَنِ الْقَلْبِ آفَاتُ الرِّيَاءِ, so then the harms of insincerity are absent from the heart. Right? فَيَنْسَاهَا, so one forgets them. فَلَمْ تَظْهَرِ الْكَرَاهِيَّةِ, so then the dislike of insincerity doesn't overcome the inclination towards it. لأنها ثمرة المعرفة, because this dislike for insincerity is the result of consciousness, of awareness. وقد يتذكر, and one may remember, فيعلم أن الذي خطر له خاطر الرياء وأنه يعرضه لسخط الله تعالى ولكن لا يحصل له الكراهية. And it may happen that one remembers that this is an insincere inclination, and that this makes one susceptible to the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But one doesn't find this dislike لِشِدَّةِ شَهْوَتِهِ, because of the intensity of their desires. You know it's wrong. That's devastating, right? Now there, you have to realize that you're sick. You're sick. And if you're not careful, you'll get sicker and sicker and sicker, right? And a lot of this insincerity occurs as one gets older, right? Because when you're a broke university student, what can you show up with, right? Right? What can you show up with, right? I mean, things that are ultimately nobody really cares about, right? But now suddenly you have a little bit of money. You got a little bit of a family. You got a house. You got this. You got this. You got this. You get ahead in your career. All these things happen. You think you're getting ahead, but all of this can nurture insincerity, and then it enters into your religion as well. You give in. Charity is one of those doors, one of the greatest doors of closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But becomes, it's one of the weirdest scenarios. One Ramadan, we had an event at Seekers, but I got invited to an old friend's house, and they had valet parking at his house. I was just thinking, what a waste of money. Because everybody knows how to park their car, right? It's not a big deal. But all these people hired just to park people's cars in a residential area. And the place was huge, facing the, and all these people show up as a very important cause. I just said, but the fundraiser said, Shaykh, don't hold any high hopes. They're not going to listen to you. They're not going to listen to me. They're just here to be seen. I was thinking that's ill opinion. At the end of the night, before I had to leave to get back to Seekers, I asked, how much did you guys raise? I said, not much. Why? Because there's a big difference. If you're there for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you hear a call to good, people will give, especially if you're able to. Any one of them could have given, tens of thousands, some of them hundreds of thousands without blinking, too much. But why? Because that's not what's driving. Right? So a lot of good gets held back because of the lack of that sincerity. But when you find that, then one needs sometimes one needs to realize, and change sometimes takes time, but you realize that if I'm finding that I know things are wrong, but I'm still slipping into them, that's a sign that I need urgent address. I need to stop and pause and ask, how do I change? Because without sincerity, I'm going to ruin myself. Right? I'm going to ruin myself in my religion, in my relationship with Allah, but also it affects all kinds of other things. Right? In relationships, etc., it is our when our hearts and minds are overcome by our desires and whims, that we make harmful worldly choices. People break up their family. Why? Because I've got a wonderful that job, that job in Florida is my dream job. But what about your family? What about this? So I want to go to Florida. It's a whim. It's just whim. Right? If we were to think about it, is it worth ruining your marriage over? Is it worth being separated from your children over? Is it worth 101 other things? And in some cases might be. But frequently we don't make even worldly decisions that are to our benefit because we're overcome by our desires or whims. Seeking status, seeking to quote unquote get ahead, etc. Rather than considering what will be pleasing to Allah, or what will be of genuine good, all things considered, in our lives. So there one has to pause and reflect. It may help to consult that this is where I'm at. How do I realign my life? And one of the things that helps in that is to travel. Right? To travel. Go on Umrah. But not the Umrah that, okay, great, I'm at this place, there, it's a 7-star hotel, and we have 7 kinds of shrimp, and we have 5 kinds of steak, and we have, like, are you making tawaf around the Kaaba, or are you making tawaf around the buffet lunch? Right? And they have 3 types of someone even tell me the kind of jacuzzi they have in their hotel suite at Umrah. It was like, okay, right? But like a proper, to do Umrah, to have a break, to recalibrate one's relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says, because when these desires, these lusts predominate, فَيَغْلِبُ هَوَاهُ, one's whim overcomes one's reason and one's heart. فَيَغْلِبُ هَوَاهُ عَقْلَهُ, so one's whim overcomes one's intellect. وَلَا يَقْدِرْ عَلَى تَرْكِ لَذَّةِ الْحَالِ, and one can't leave the immediate desire or lust, such as the desire of praise, of recognition, etc. فَيَسْتَلِذْ بِالشَّهْوَةِ وَيَتَسَوَّفْ بِالتَّوْبَةِ, so one finds pleasure in the lust and one puts off repentance. أو يتشاغل عن الفكر في ذلك, or one busies oneself from thinking about it. لشدة الشهوة, because of the intensity of that desire. And that's the danger of when sins become habitual. Right? When sins become habitual, because then it becomes much more difficult to break habits. Because someone who falls into a sin, it's easy, just get up, repent, leave it. When it becomes a habit, plucking that out becomes a lot more difficult. But it remains remains obligatory, becomes even more incumbent. Right? When these become habits. فَكَمْ مِنْ عَالِمٍ يَحْضُرُهُ كَلَامْ لَا يَدْعُو إِلَى قَوْلِهِ إِلَّا الرِّيَاءِ. He says, for how many a scholar, words occur to them that they say, to which they're only moved by insincerity. They want to be known for saying something smart or eloquent or this or that, right? Right? And if this applies to scholars, it applies to others as well. Okay, you're sharing these hadiths about whatever. Why? So, my cousins really like when I share religious messages. So why do you do it? Right? It's not whether you should share hadiths once in a while with family, etc. That's a good action. But look at your intention. Because the assumption is that in this worldly life, we incline towards these tangible matters: wealth, praise, recognition, status. Right? Sincerity has to be assumed to be exceptional. And anything that's exceptional, you have to make sure, you have to make sure of it. Right? Right? Someone new comes at work and they work under you. You can't just assume they'll know what to do. You have to assume that they have no clue. You have to train them properly. Likewise, in your actions, you have to assume, any new action that you're doing, that you have no clue about being sincere in it. So you have to work hard to ensure you're sincere before you do it. وهو يعلم ذلك, and you may know that. لكنه يستمر عليه ولا يكرهه, but one may remain on this kind of habit and not dislike it. فتكون الحجة عليه, and then the proof will be against one. بِآكَدْ, even more so, إِذْ قَبْلَ دَاعِيَ الرِّيَاءِ, because one accepted the call of insincerity. مَا عِلْمِهِ بِهِ, despite knowing it. وَبِغَائِلَتِهِ, and knowing its harms. وَقَدْ يَحْضُرُ الْمَعْرِفَةَ وَالْكَرَاهِيَّةِ, and in other cases one may be aware and dislike both of them. وَلَكِنْ لَا يَحْصُلْ لَهُ الْإِبَاءِ, but one does not find the strength to turn away from it. بَلْ يَقْبَلْ دَاعِيَ الرِّيَاءِ, but rather one accepts the call of insincerity. وَيَعْمَلْ بِهِ, and one acts upon it. Praise, showing off, recognition, etc. لِكَوْنِ الْكَرَاهِيَّةِ لَهُ ضَعِيفًا, because one's dislike for it is weak. بِالنِّسْبَةِ إِلَى قُوَّةِ الشَّهْوَةِ, with respect to the strength of the desire, والرغبة, and avidness. وهذا أيضا لا ينتفع بكراهيته, and that too you won't find benefit by disliking it. إذ الغرض منها صرفه عن الفعل, because the purpose of disliking the insincere thought is to turn away from it, right? To be a counterbalance so that sincerity can prevail. فإذا لا فائدة إلا في اجتماع الثلاثة. So he said, therefore, you need all three. You need to be aware of insincerity, right? You have to dislike insincerity, or have intense, or cultivate intense inclination towards Allah, right? Right? Through love, through longing, through gratitude. And number three, you have to refuse, right? You have to refuse. You need awareness, dislike, and then refusal. فإذا اجتمعت هذه الثلاثة فقد برئ من الرياء. If you manage to get all of these three together, right? Awareness of insincerity, dislike for insincerity, or strong cultivation of sincerity. And all of spirituality goes back to the actualization of sincerity. Because what is, they say, the most comprehensive definition of, most comprehensive scholarly definition of tasawwuf, of spirituality, is sidqu tawajjuhi ila Allah, is to be truly directed towards Allah. Bima amar, in what He has commanded. Wa ala al-wajhi alladhi yurdihi, and in the ways that are pleasing to Him. And that's sincerity. Sidqu tawajjuhi ila Allah, being truly directed towards Allah. Right? And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran. Iyaka na'bud, tells us to say, it is you alone we are devoted to. Wa iyaka nasta'in, is you alone that we are reliant upon. Right? ومجرد خطور الرياء وميل الطبع إليه وحبه له ومنازعته إياه لا يضر. It says mere thoughts of insincerity and some inclination towards it, but without accepting the thought or the inclination, or finding some liking for it, but with, but while dismissing it, does not harm. Because it's part of being human. We have to be on guard, right? Because where there's sparks, eventually there'll be flames, right? Right? So I have more spiritual work to do to quell those inclinations. إذا لم يكن منه قبول, as long as you don't accept those thoughts. وركون بالاختيار, and you don't choose those things. You don't say yes to it. You don't say yes to it. The thought occurs, you're not responsible for your thoughts. You're responsible when you say yes to it. But when bad thoughts comes, because there's something underlying it that is stirring it. إذ ليس في وسع العبد منع الشيطان عن نزغاته. Because you cannot avoid the whisperings of the shaitan. ولا قمع الطبع حتى لا يميل إلى الشهوات. And you cannot quell your nature from inclining towards its desires. ولا ينزع إليها وإنما غايته أن يقابل شهوته بكراهية. Rather, all you can do is to oppose these desires with dislike, right? These desires with dislike. And then he'll close by telling us final counsels on how to acquire sincerity. But one of the so we mentioned also the importance of having regular spiritual practice, right? To the act of praying with sincerity, right? And all the adhkar within the prayer and after the prayer and the du'as that we say. I think like Sayyidul Istighfar, right? The greatest mode of seeking forgiveness. Even after the prayer, saying Astaghfirullah 3 times is an expression of sincerity. That my prayer was meant to be purely for you. Because what sin have you committed in the prayer? It's largely due to the lack of sincerity that you seek istighfar. That you deserved better from me, oh Allah. Not just in the form, but in the substance of your prayer, right? And then to have time with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the morning and in the night, right? And to practice making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also to consult, especially before big things, to consult. And that's why having good company helps as well. Good. Okay. Like recently, one of the great scholars passed away. So I asked one of my teachers, and he's a person of deep sincerity. I said, and I know he spent a lot of time with this scholar. Said, why don't you write something about it? Said, I haven't come, I don't have a good intention in it yet. I knew what he was talking about, because a lot of times someone passes away, people write, I visited him at this time, and I used to teach with him, and I learned this from him, and I this, and I this, and I... Is this really an obituary about the person who passed away? Or is it more about yourself? Right? That's why Abu Madian says, al-mudda'i man ashara ila nafsi. The one making claims is the one who's pointing towards themselves. Says, as for the sincere person, they're pointing towards Allah, towards God and the good. Towards God and the good. Now towards God, it goes back to one's intention. Other people don't know about that most of the time. Right? But as long as the focus is pointing people towards the good, and within your intention is to seek the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through it, that's a circle of safety. The danger is when you are pointing towards yourself. Now in some situations, pointing towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, pointing towards the good, may entail zuhur, being manifest. But one doesn't do it because one wants to be prominent, manifest, etc. Right? Being sincere doesn't mean that you don't seek the promotion. We seek the promotion because this will be a means for good. Right? That through this promotion, whether you're able to earn more to take better care of your family for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or this puts you in a position to be of better benefit through whatever line of work you are. So you're able to deploy bigger and more impactful projects that are of benefit to people, even if they don't actually benefit from it. Okay? I have a friend who's like, we used to play a guessing game, because whatever leading edge project was taking place, whatever leading edge company at that point in time in the Silicon Valley, he'd be working there. He'd call me, we'd talk every year or so. He said, so where do you think I'm working right now? I said, are you at Square? There's, for a while there's this payments thing. How do you know? I said, we know the principal. So, are you at Uber these days? Say, yeah, I'm the CTO. Or the CDO, Chief Design Officer. Because at that time, Uber was innovating the most. But he's a really sincere guy. He usually calls about his intentions. So I said, what do you intend through all these apps that people use in curious ways? He said, I intend all good possible through it. Whether people fulfill it or not, you guys taught me that I'm responsible for my intentions. Right? He said, how? He explained. I said, mashallah. Because he was troubled. Like he was one of the chief designers behind a number of tech guys. Said a lot of people just buy them to show off. They don't really need it. But you intend that people use it for the good, because there's a lot of possibilities for the good, and a lot of good does happen through this technology. So you have those good intentions. Right? There's all kinds of noble intentions in any aspect of work. But one of the things that benefits is, that's one of the best things to consult about, is how do I approach this in a manner that'll be of good to me in my relationship with Allah, protect me from any harm from it, and be a means of good for others. The Prophet ﷺ taught us, even when we put on new clothing, we intend the good in it and from it and through it. That, oh Allah, this is a jacket, for example. The dua, Allahumma hadha al-thawb. Allahumma inni as'aluka khayrahu. Allah asks you for the good of it. Wa khayra ma suni'a min ajlihi. And the best of what it was made for. And I seek refuge in you from the harm of it, and the harm of what it was made for, and the harm of its people. So in some narrations, it's harm and the harm it was made for. The other narration mentions three things. I ask you for its good, and the good of its people, and the good of what they made it for. And I seek refuge in you from its harm, and the harm of its people, and the harm of what it was made for. Because everything has possibilities of benefit and harm. Right? Even in an item of clothing, right? Even in an item of clothing, right? Because that same item of clothing, you could wear it to show off and to do this or that, or people do all kinds of wacky things. Abu Yusuf, the student of Abu Hanifa, used to dress spectacularly well. They asked him, why do you dress well? Why do you dress like that? He said, just like I like my wife to look good for me, I like to look good for my wife. It's a very good intention, right? If it's for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Any questions before we close, inshallah? Go ahead.
Maybe a confusing question at first, but inshallah. Is there a limit to which worldly achievement is no longer compatible with being sincere? Is there a limit to achievement, one, or a limit to materialism, or whatever this is? Where you're making it harder for yourself to be sincere?
Yeah. Is there a limit to worldly achievement? In terms of sincerity?
Yeah.
I mean, the danger is the beautiful dua of the Prophet, وَلَا تَجْعَلِ الدُّنْيَا أَكْبَرَ هَمِّنَا وَلَا مَبْلَغَ عِلْمِنَا. Don't make this worldly life the greatest of our concerns, nor the limits of our knowledge. Right? And things tend to take one over. Right? So, at the same time, so the Prophet ﷺ cautioned, and there's a beautiful, I just translated it, it's not for me, on Seekers on what does it mean to seek one's provision beautifully? Right? So the Prophet ﷺ commented, he saw someone heading to work, really rushed early in the morning. It's praiseworthy to head to work early. The person seemed to be a bit over concerned. The Prophet ﷺ made the comment that, as part of a longer hadith, فَأَجْمِلُوا فِي الطَّلَبِ, that know that no one will attain, that you seek your provision, but know that no one will attain except what has been destined for it. فَأَجْمِلُوا فِي الطَّلَبِ, so pursue with beautiful, dignified restraint. Why? Because your work has rights over you, but your career has rights over you, but your family has rights over you, your Lord has rights over you. You have rights over yourself. Right? So to keep that balance. So the Prophet ﷺ gave us another hadith saying that أعطي كل ذي حق حقه, give all who have a right their due right. Right? So yeah, you have a right You know, like, okay, someone wants to get ahead in their career, do this and do that, but then at what expense? Right? At what expense? And at the same time, you know, there are things that if the intention is good, and you know, people have different circumstances, right? That where do people strike the balance? It depends on people's circumstance. There's some people who, you know, their circumstances allow them, you know, like there's a bunch of medical doctors here, you know, in our community, who, mashallah, any crisis happens in the world, they go overseas and they're helping and they're doing this, but their family situation allows that. But there's other people who may not be able to do that. They have to take care of elderly parents, and that's no less important, right? So they say your place is where Allah places you. That where I am, where is the good pleasure of Allah? All things considered, right? And different people have different circumstances, right? I have, subhanAllah, one of my good friends, actually the Seekers team called his wife because, and she said, if you could take me off the list, because we don't have any money and we don't expect to have any money anytime soon. And I know, so her husband, who's involved in community work, etc., was broke before they married. He's still broke. A few years ago, she sent me a message saying, my husband, your friend, he's really worried that things are tight in our house, this and that. But I married him because of what he's involved in. Please reassure him that I only married him because of this dedication. Right? That I'll support him for the rest of my life if I have to. But I want him dedicated to what he's dedicated to. I'm usually very wary of getting involved in family things, but I talked to my friend. He didn't need too much convincing, but different people have different circumstances, and their tests are different, right? One of the harms of materialism, sometimes we imagine that our success is tied to a number, etc., right? And it's not, right? Our success is what's tawfiq? Is for the servant's actions to correspond to the good pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, given what their circumstances are. Okay? It's like one of the big scholars in North America just travel all over the place all the time. Now he's sort of keeping largely a low key. Why? Because they're taking care, him and his wife are taking care of a close relative of theirs. Most people don't know. So he's not accepting invitations, he's not doing this. But what he does is, now things are a little bit different. He connects them to other younger scholars who can engage in those programs and so on as well. So people's circumstances change. And also one should because part of sincerity is that one's not concerned about other people and this, that. Where is the pleasure of Allah in my circumstance? It frees one up. It frees one up. I have a friend whose older brother owns a hospital in the US. Really wealthy. His brother deliberately this a few years ago, I guess the price may have gone up, would drive a $500 like rickety van. He said, why? He said, a car, I think like a neurosurgeon or something really fancy. A car has 4 wheels and seats by which you get from point A to point B. So literally, but he said, I do that so my kids know what the priorities are in life. And he owns a hospital and really wealthy, and but said we try to use the money according to priorities. So they generally enjoy themselves. Said, I'm not captive to other people's whims, because ultimately, who cares? They're impressed by your car. So what? So you wouldn't like a good car? Not really. And of course, different people have different circumstances, right? Even from the Sahaba, there are of the Sahaba who dressed exceedingly well, and there's others who were really troubled once after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, as the Muslims expanded, a lot of wealth came even to Mecca and Medina. And some of the Sahaba were very disturbed that this worldliness will take over the companions. So one of them held that you should not keep money at home till the next day. So and one of the very learned Sahaba, they had to be reminded that isn't zakat mentioned in the Quran? He said, yes. He said, when is zakat due? He said, after a year passes on your wealth. So he says, so therefore, you can keep your wealth beyond one day. Because if you didn't have wealth for beginning end of the zakat year, then by definition there'd be no more zakat left in the world. But he just kept quiet because he still didn't like that. And those are different, different people have different circumstances. Alhamdulillah. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Go ahead.
I can conceive of somebody who is putting forth effort to worship some people from technically total heedlessness to pausing and making that intention and making it sincere.
How does one leave heedlessness? By remembrance, right? No, it's by successive approximation, right? The one is like any virtue. First thing to do is to intend it and to learn about it and act as that virtue entails. So you have all kinds of insincerity, right? They say, how can you have presence of heart in prayer without having any presence of heart in the prayer? Say, by intending it. Because are you responsible for being present in your prayer? No. You are only responsible for the striving. Let's say you're at work, there's a major crisis going on, and you messed up big time in the presentation that initially you were so proud of. And 101 things, right? There's a very embarrassing ringtone called Hello Bhaijan, right? Which in Pakistan I played in the office by mistake. I triggered at the office of the Grand Mufti of Pakistan. I went there to ask him some questions, and I think it was a good lesson for Allah, because I'd prepared the question really well. I was like, But then sometimes, they say the slaps of the beloved, how sweet they are. Because I was there, kind of impressed by my question. And there's 5 of the senior scholars of Pakistan sitting with the Mufti. The Grand Mufti of Pakistan's office is like, the roof is about twice this height, because they're often, they have tall roofs to keep the place cool, but could easily fit 250 people, slightly longer than our hall here. So I'm sitting in the middle, they're over there, and my cell phone goes off. Hello Bhaijan, This really, if you type Hello Bhaijan ringtone, you'll see it. It's all over the internet. Deeply embarrassing. Sometimes we get these kinds of things as reminders, but if you intend a virtue, I want to be present with Allah, and you strive, وَأَلَّيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى, and that every person shall have nothing but what they strive for. This is both exclusionary and affirmative, that you will only have what you did strive for, but it also said إِلَّا مَا سَعَى, and what is ma? Is general, right? So it excludes that you won't have that which you didn't strive for, right? So the fact that your wife gives a lot in charity and it's got nothing to do with you, she's giving charity by her intention with her wealth, and you didn't even encourage it, you won't be rewarded for her charity. She's active in the community, this and that. Are you rewarded for it if you had nothing to do with it? No, right? I mean, you're rewarded for what you facilitated. But you will have all that you strive for. They say even if you didn't attain it, even though you didn't attain it. So, you make that commitment. Right? You make the commitment that I want act sincerely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I want to be conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then there's a knowledge component to know how do I acquire that virtue, what it is it, why is it important, how do I acquire it, but also the practical toolkit of how do I operationalize this in my life. And sometimes some things we find easy, but if you're struggling, have mercy on yourself. Just go consult. Simple as that. Just go consult. And don't try to be too smart. Ask. I'm struggling with this. How do I deal with it? And sometimes you find it's much easier than we imagine. Right? I was embarrassed. I've been trying to I've had like a whole slew of highly unsuccessful attempts at making steak. Usually because I get distracted by doing something. Once actually the misaga, like the fire department showed up. What do they call them? The fire trucks? They showed up because I was having vision issues that time. But I was lost in thoughts while trying to pan sear my steak, and the fire alarm went off because there's so much smoke in the house. So they showed up within 2 minutes because we're in central Mississauga. I was actually really happy. Alhamdulillah, if there is a fire, they're going to show up within 2 minutes. So I was so happy when I answered the door. I said, sir, I said, I'm sorry, was very feeble about it. And they said, they didn't charge, they technically charge you like large amount. But my wife did it once today, like made steak. And it was really good. Why? She just followed a recipe, right? Followed her. She's not a big fan of steak, doesn't watch 101 videos about steaks or whatever. Just follow the recipe, right? Similarly, sometimes you don't know what to do. Just find out a reliable way of doing it and just do it. That's all it takes. So, and too often we just try to cook up our own deen, and we're left with a lot of smoke and a burnt steak, right? Just find a recipe and follow it. Okay? And if you can't follow a recipe, then ask an expert. Alhamdulillah. Barakallahu ta'ala fikum. Alhamdulillah. You had a question, Sid?
I was going to ask, do bad thoughts come from other than shaitan or nafs?
Sometimes the nafs, it can also be, we have our fears, we have our misgivings, all kinds of different things, right? That's part of the hawa, one's whim. Right? That one has insecurity, all kinds of things, fear of people, worldly inclinations, and there's different things. But the simple question, the Prophet ﷺ, istafti qalbak, seek an answer from your heart. Even if people give you answer after answer. What's the answer from your heart? Like, what's the question you ask your heart to get the right answer? Is what will be pleasing to Allah? That's the question to ask the heart. And that given the relevant considerations, what choice is most likely to be most pleasing to Allah? Or at the very least, what choices are acceptable to Allah? So be within the circle of acceptability. You can do what's more pleasing to Allah, that's better. If you can try to do what's most beloved to Allah, that's best. But at least be within that circle of acceptability. That's the seek a fatwa from your heart. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Go ahead.
So I was wondering, is there a relationship between the food that one eats and having such negative traits like and so on? Are there any bringing them about or making it more difficult to let go of?
Yeah, no. It's clear in the Quran that does the food you eat affect your state? Definitely. As in the hadith, إِنَّ اللَّهَ طَيِّبٌ لَا يَقْبَلُ إِلَّا طَيِّبًا. Right? The hadith continues that وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ أَمَرَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ بِمَا أَمَرَ بِهِ الْمُرْسَلِينَ. That Allah commanded the believers what He commanded the messengers. That eat of the lawful things that we provided you and do righteous deeds. Right? And the hadith, one of the clear things in it, وَمَطْعَمُهُ حَرَامٌ وَمَشْرَبُهُ حَرَامٌ. That eating the unlawful makes one's actions unacceptable to Allah. But it's understood that if you eat questionable, disliked things or questionable things, or from questionable earnings, or eat things that are enveloped in heedlessness, etc., it's going to affect your state, right? And there's a lot that's been said about that, both in the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ and also in the teachings of the early Muslims. That's why Imam Ahmad was asked, what is scrupulousness? He said, eating the halal, right? And the early Muslims, they say, had more concern for eating the halal than for praying at night. Because if you don't eat the halal, because eating the halal is not just it's halal, that it's earned in a lawful way, acquired in a lawful way. There's, you try to have things that are tayyib, right? And to the extent that one can do that, and in our times, if you see how animals are treated, etc., these are all sources of or even all the things that they put in the food, etc. All these things disturb, even at a physical level, disturb the human being, let alone emotionally and intellectually, spiritually, right? Right? Now there's people advocating to take mind-altering drugs. Right? Very popular. I used to read his books regularly. He's a very respected writer, advocating for mind-altering drugs. Right? But if you have no concept of truth, anything goes. Okay? As long just don't do it at work, because you may get fired. Right? But yeah, no, it makes a huge difference, right? And of the practical things is to be careful where one gets one's meat from, for example. Right? There's a lot of places that do really shady things, right? Because you have to assume anytime corners can be cut, they will be cut, right? So you get your you get your fix of Indian food or whatever kind of food from a place where I think that background music, they blast lewd and haram music. They have all kinds of haram imagery on their walls. They're all kinds of questionable things, but our meat is halal. If you don't care about the limits of Allah, about 10 other things, now we're not saying that no, it's not halal, but there's a clear question mark. There's a clear question mark about that. So there's a reasonable caution. Just be careful, where you get it. And especially now in places like Toronto, there's so many halal options. A lot of people, when they order online, say, yeah, it seems fine. And most of these delivery services, you have very little information about the place, etc., etc. Some places say they're halal, but you actually go to the menu. And how is it halal? God knows, right? So you just need to be really, really careful. Right? Not really, really careful, but it's just practical caution. You're going to buy meat anywhere, anyways. Just take that extra moment of consideration. Choose a place that is careful. Long term, in most of the world they have halal certification. That's something good if it's facilitated in the part of town you are to get. Like here we have HMC, I think it's called, or whatever. You can get something that's HMC certified, or at least, especially if you go to a butcher regularly, just find out, okay, where do you get your meat from? You just have to ask once, just to make sure. And we judge by the outward. We're not making a judgment on the person, but they seem to be God-fearing people. And we check. I mean, if they can be just, if there's HMC, there's a formal certification, that's better. Or at the very least, where does their meat come from? And just practical caution. It doesn't take that much, because then most of us typically buy meat from one or two places. Just make sure it's typically the places that are certified or legit are not more expensive than places that are not. Because those things do affect one. And anything that's been touched by sin or wrongdoing affects one's state. Right? Affects one's state. So, yeah. And wholesome things, even like, you're going to buy your clothing, buy something that's from an ethical source. It doesn't have to be a Muslim. There are a lot of companies that have good ethical practices and this, that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a lot more expensive, whatever. Even from a practical perspective, it's better to get 6 pairs of socks that'll last you 2 years than to get 26 pairs of socks that get holes. Although you can end up in a lose-lose too. I ended up starting to buy from an expensive sock company, and I'm a holy man. Like I got now 17 pairs of socks from this company, all with holes in them. So I realized, there's some problem in the process, either from them or from me, for how we wash the socks. It's quite sad because they're really good socks. And it's a good ethical company. Alhamdulillah. But the righteous would also have other concerns as well. Like Imam Zarnuji in his book on the Adab of the Student say, one of the reasons the righteous would avoid eating in the marketplace was out of sincere concern for others. That if you're eating out in public and there's poor people who pass by, it will hurt their feelings because they don't have. Whereas a believer would consider, okay, how do we eat of the good and partake it with others? But then the counter to that, the ulama say that one of the ways to have gratitude for one's, to eat out of gratitude, that any time, for example, if you take your family out for a meal or you order food, you don't have to be the same amount, give something in charity so that other people can partake as well. It doesn't have to be like, you got a meal for, like you have a family, it goes $70, $100, make a $5 donation, make a $10 donation as well, that a family somewhere else can also eat. And that's a way that is genuinely out of gratitude to Allah, not just a whimsical thing. Right? That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ. You won't attain righteousness until you spend of what you love. Sometimes it's that you get something of the good, get it for someone else as well. Or get similar for someone else. You're ordering some meal for yourself, order it for a friend. Just surprise them. Okay? Of course, now we overcomplicate it. What if they don't like it, whatever? You're rewarded for your intention. Try to get something they like, but someone else will eat it in their house. That's over-analysis.